All right, guys, here we are once again with our discussion on the history of philosophy. Now, I'm about to press this, so it'll probably do something crazy, so get ready. And it did, of course. It's all right. We can fix that. Now, we left off with Descartes, right? And we're making, more than a few leaps in our characters in regard to the figures that we're discussing in the history of philosophy, right? In our course here. Now, just as we mentioned, we're having to do this because of the extreme time frame that we're trying to cover, right? In the course of the history of philosophy. So even when I pull out particular characters like Descartes, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, those that we've discussed thus far today, David Hume, it's not necessarily that the others are not important, right? So, for instance, the ones we will discuss are going to be of huge magnitude, right, within the course of the history of philosophy and the history of ideas and whatnot. And so it might be thought by some that the assumption may be, well, if you don't discuss others, they may not necessarily be as important. No, there may be some that are just as important, right? But we just don't have necessarily the time to talk about them, again, because of the length of the subject at hand here. Now, of course, there are going to be some what would be considered minor philosophers within the history of philosophy. But I just don't want you to get the impression that if we don't discuss them, then they're not as important as the ones that we've discussed. But you can take confidence in knowing that the ones we do discuss are some of the more important figures within the history of philosophy. In fact, to assume that the others aren't would be to commit an informal fallacy, right? If we're discussing logic, naming an argument from silence there. Anyway, that's for another course. So let's go ahead and go into this with David Hume, and this discussion about David Hume is going to be very similar to the way that we approached the discussion to Descartes. Just as we looked at Descartes as a rationalist, right, as a picture of what we would call a rationalist in his epistemology and his philosophy, David Hume is going to be an empiricist, right? So you have a rationalist on one extreme or one end of the spectrum, Descartes, that knowledge is primarily gleaned, gotten to, right, through the mind, right, and you can't necessarily trust the senses. And Hume is going to be he's going to be something like a hard empiricist, that not only the primary way that you can approach truth and gain truth is going to be through the senses, but for the most part, it's pretty much the only way. And anything that goes beyond the senses, as we're going to see, is just not viable. It's just not verifiable. It's not something that can even be entertained as even possibly being true. So just as an important point, so you can go ahead and just jot this down so that you know. You may have heard of logical positivism. Again, if you're an apologetics junkie, right? You may have heard of scientism if you're an apologetics junkie or a philosophy junkie. And essentially, those two outlooks, those two worldviews, logical positivism, which is a philosophy with beliefs in regards to metaphysics and all those sorts of things and epistemology, and scientism, which is kind of an informal epistemology. It's called scientism because people hold to it and they just don't know it. But they really find their roots here in this skepticism of David Hume here. Now, let's go. So when I say that we're going to approach this in the same way that we looked at the Descartes lecture, we're going to approach it in the same way, in the sense that I'm going to give you this overview here, but then I'm going to go to a paper, again, that I wrote within roughly the same time frame as the Descartes piece, and read through that and offer some commentary in that as well. But before we get to that paper, let's go ahead and look at a couple of these points that are going to make themselves known, or that are going to be presented or looked at, going to make an appearance in some sense in the paper there. Now, David Hume noting the first point here again. And again, I've got all the slides. These will be made available to you at the end of the course. So even though we're not going to necessarily go through the slides in this lecture, it'll be more about the paper. You'll have these at the end of the course that you can go back to, use to teach, whatever you want to use these for. So David Hume was a Scottish skeptical philosopher. Now, unlike many of the other philosophers, he actually made a very nice living. He was very wealthy because of some of his writings. Now, it wasn't necessarily his philosophical writings and musings that gained him this wealth and whatnot. He wrote a history of England that ended up being, widely, it was published, it was widely distributed. It was I don't know, for all lack of better terms, it was on the New York Times bestseller list, right, in his day and age. And so it generated a lot of wealth for him. Now, his philosophical musings, at least the two most important that we'll consider, is an inquiry in regard to human understanding. My goodness, man, I forgot the title of it. It's right over here. An essay concerning human understanding. That's John Locke. So let's see. Where's my Hume volume? Here it is. Okay. Well, no. It's titled the same as Locke. Yeah, so I was right. Here we go, right here. An inquiry concerning human understanding, right? Has a couple other pieces here too. These are really cheap. I think they're Hackett Publishing. Yeah, you can get these off Amazon very cheaply here for the primary source material if you want that. So an inquiry concerning human understanding, and then also a dialogue concerning natural religion is one of his other famous works. Now, this inquiry concerning human understanding that we'll look at as we go through this is going to really discuss the whole issue about metaphysics, what exists beyond the physical, his epistemology, all these sorts of things, and then the dialogue concerning natural religion. That's really where he goes after, as you're going to see here on this slide, the objections to God, miracles, things of that nature, the design argument. So, in fact, a lot of the design arguments, the counters to design arguments that you hear, have their root in David Hume, specifically dialogues concerning natural religion. I'm again back here somewhere in my books. So we're going to look at a few of those. Now, his epistemology, as I've already mentioned, is going to be a hard form of empiricism. And I don't want to give away too much at that because we'll look at that in a moment. Also, we're going to see a couple counters to his systems. A couple counters to some of his points some of his points he believes would destroy any sort of real sense of knowledge. And we're going to look at some of the counters to that. They'll just come up naturally within that paper. Now, specifically, one of the massive, one of the massive points that Hume brings up is going to be this idea between cause and effect, what's become known in philosophy as the problem of induction. So if you've had a intro to philosophy course, or if you're familiar with philosophy, or again, apologetics junkie of some sort, then you've probably heard of the problem of induction. And interestingly enough, that most modern philosophers, theist or otherwise, really don't have a nice solution to the problem of induction. Some of them, many philosophers just dismiss it as an oddity of some sort and don't really concern themselves too much with it. And others try to give some sort of answer to it that, look, this is just the way things are, so we will take it more or less as if things do have a cause and effect, as if we can know the relation between cause and effect. Kant actually does something similar to that, but much more in depth, but similar to that type of approach, and we'll look at that. Even today, we'll gloss over that, something about Kant, even though we're going to discuss him later in a little more depth. So those are just some of the topics that will come up here. So let me go ahead and introduce you to, and also we're going to look at a video, just like we did a few weeks ago, when I was talking about the four causes, right? We're going to look at another video filmed in the same location, same context, different day, but same context, where I discussed the counter to his objections that miracles are not necessarily something that should be believed. So let me introduce you to a concept or two before we go to the paper. And this problem of induction, this cause and effect, what that's saying, a lot of people have misunderstood Hume in the sense that they've said that, well, Hume argues that there's no such thing as cause and effect, in the sense that things can come into existence out of nothing. There doesn't have to be a cause for anything. Well, Hume never actually argued that. Hume was arguing that we weren't justified in our knowledge of what actually can cause or what does cause something to come into existence. So he's not saying. I was reading a philosophy blog at some point in time by a friend of mine I think he had completed his BA in philosophy, and he had written a blog about how essentially he was driving somewhere in his car and the sock comes flying up from the back seat. And I mean, this is stuff literally you only read in fairy tales or when you're reading philosophy blogs, right? And the sock comes flying up from the back seat, and he's convinced that it's senseless to even ask what caused the sock to fly up from the back seat, because as Hume has written and proven, that things don't even have to have a cause, right? Well, that's just mistaken. Hume did not argue that things don't necessarily have a cause. He's just arguing that we're not justified in knowing what that causal relationship is. That was Hume's point there. Also, many have argued or have believed Hume to claim that miracles are not possible at all. Now, Spinoza, right? Benedict Spinoza, whom we don't have time to get into to Spinoza, but he would have been someone that did argue that miracles are not possible at all. But Hume is not arguing that. Hume has a less radical approach. He's not saying that they're not possible. He's just saying that even if miracles are possible, you shouldn't believe them. And we'll look at that, right? That seems to be a little more threatening, right? So if you watch a debate between a theist, right, and someone who is not a theist, and the theist uses an argument for a miracle for miracles, let's just say the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, right? Or let's say that they have a relative who has some sort of miraculous event happen in their life. Say they're paralyzed, and one night in prayer, they radically regain everything immediately, all of their mobility, all this sort of stuff. I'm not talking about the silly televangelist stuff. I'm talking about something like that, right? Then Hume would even say, okay, or what if the interlocutor there, what if the debate partner, the one across the aisle in the debate says, I'll concede that that's completely possible, but my argument shows why you shouldn't even believe it anyway. Even if it did happen, you shouldn't believe it, right? That's a little more threatening, right? That's a little scary for the theist that would want to try to argue contra to the atheistic position using a miracle, right? Now, let's go ahead and look at this paper. Just so you know, I'll go ahead and let you see some of these points that we're going to make. Like I said, that Hume is going to be known for his skepticism, right? Now, some would argue, some wouldn't, that Hume wanted skepticism to be true. But needless to say, whatever side of the aisle the scholars fall on in that regard, no one can doubt that Hume's philosophy led to radical skepticism, that his conclusions lead one to radical, a radical form of skepticism, again, that would call into question the most widely assumed truths. And I put truths there because under Hume's system, under Hume's philosophy, those things aren't necessarily true. So I'm not calling them truths in scare quotes because I don't think they're true, or that other philosophers may not think they're true. But under Hume's system, under the conclusions that would be the result of Hume's outworking, right? Hume's logical outworking there, that they just wouldn't be true, right? So for instance, that there's a self, right? That there's a you behind this meat baggage, so to speak. There's a you. Well, that would be erased. Again, the law of causality, right? Cause and effect, that you can know the relation between an A and B is in terms of their causal relationship, that you could know that's erased. Again, something like, 99% of the population believes something like miracles are possible. Hume says, well, even if they're possible, you shouldn't even believe them anyway, right? Just all of these sorts of what most people would consider to be basic truths just aren't at all, right? Again, even any sort of knowledge about God cannot really be known if Hume is correct in his conclusions. Again, that would be considered by most people to be something that people can know, that claims about God, that knowledge about God can be known. If Hume's correct, then there are no truths about God, right, that can actually be known. So again, looking at some of this is called Hume's fork. His epistemology would be called Hume's fork. Well, that would be the reductionistic account of what is of what his epistemology would be called. We'll look at that. Objections to God, miracles, and whatnot. So just showing you all of this is here. When you get these, you can use them however you like. So let's go ahead and go to, from this point, let's go ahead and go to the paper. Let me pull that up. Just whistling so you know that I'm still here. All right, let's press this. All right, here's our paper. I got that up. All right, so the title of this particular essay was The Beginnings of a Problem of Induction with a Possible Alternative. Right, so again, this is going to be similar to the approach that we took with Descartes, and then I'll offer my commentary as well. Hopefully that'll be a little more eloquent than last time. Hopefully this will be a little more polished, right, than it was last time. Now, first we're going to give an overview of what Hume does here, right? And again, because this is a history of philosophy course, I'm assuming that some of you are familiar with philosophy, right? That you're already familiar with these ideas that have gone about, but you may not be. So I'm going to try to give any sort of commentary where I think it may need to be given here. So, without further ado, here we go. The problem of induction has become something of an intellectual plague upon the philosophical community for the last few hundred years. And remember, when I say the problem of induction, I'm talking about that we can't know the cause and effect relationship between things, right? So to give Hume's famous example, he uses billiards, right? Or what we, in the States, we call pool, right? You're shooting pool, right? Wherever else they call it, billiards. Now, Hume would say, without getting into some of the metaphysical background at this point, Hume would say that when you watch the man, right, the gentleman, pull back the cue stick, whatever the particular action is when billiards players, do a game of billiards. But when you smack the cue ball, as we would say, right, that you see the stick, the cue stick hit the cue ball, which in turn hits the other particular ball, right? And you think that there's a causal relationship between the stick hitting the cue ball, hitting the cue, and then it moving, and then of course the ball hitting another ball that moved. He's saying that you assume that there's a causal relationship between those two events: the stick hitting the ball and the ball moving. But Hume would say if you pay very careful attention to what's going on there, he would say, notice that you never actually see cause and effect. He said, you see a stick moving and you see a ball moving, but you never see cause and effect. You never see anything outside of the stick or inside of the stick, for that matter, in regard to metaphysical concepts, and nothing outside of the ball. You just see stick, ball, movement. You don't see, can you point cause and effect anywhere out to me? Can you show me cause and effect, right? So, and this is going to become a little more clear at what he's trying to get at here as we go through this. But that's roughly his first and most famous example, usually is the billiards example. So, and it is because of this significant amount of time that the apparent problem has become accepted as just that, an actual problem. Yet what if there was no such problem as it relates to induction? In other words, what if there was no such problem? What if there just is no problem between knowing cause and effect, right? Suppose that it be quite possible, were the foundations the root of the initial issue examined, that the alleged problem was actually born of the philosophical missteps of an individual. Suppose that the issue at hand owes much, if not most of, the supposed problem of induction to a plump Scotsman, David Hume. If you Google a picture of David Hume, he was a little plump. Excuse me. Now, having said as much, it may provide something of benefit to roughly outline the thinking of Hume as it pertains to induction. But even more, it is quite true to say that one may begin with John Locke. Now, you may be thinking, oh, great, what are we doing now, John Locke? Well, one of the ways that, again, remember, all of these ideas, the history of philosophy, it's hard to understand one particular philosopher without seeing the ideas that he's reacting with, that he's either taking to be as true, and then he runs with that to go with the logical implications of those ideas, or if he's trying to counter some idea, right? So for the most part, the philosophy of history is not done in a vacuum, right? There's cultural context, relation of ideas here. So we're going to look at another influential philosopher. He doesn't have his own slide on our presentation here in our lecture, but you're going to get a little dose of this right here too, so you can understand Hume better. John Locke, right? So let's begin a bit there with his epistemology, how he thinks we know things. So before we even look at Hume, we're going to look at that. And one could perhaps go as far back as Descartes, yet this essay, we're not going to worry about Descartes here. So then, one ought to begin with Locke's teaching that, to oversimplify quite a bit, Locke calls whatever this is, right, in this instance, a phone, a cup, whatever there is external to you, whether that be another person, book, grass, whatever, trees, whatever, anything else external to you. Locke identifies that as a, quote, the thing I know not what. So again, this is Locke's term for the external existing thing of the external world. And he would say that this thing, I know not what, has a certain power. This is the verbiage that he uses. It has a power to cause impressions on the human mind. And it was by these impressions or perceptions that one might gain knowledge of an external world. So, for example, whatever this thing is, I'm looking at it, right? It happens to be an old version of a phone, right? I always get the old versions, they're cheaper, right? So it's an old version of a phone here. And this thing somehow has the thing. I don't know the thing in of itself, because what I have access to when I look at this is this has the power to cause certain impressions upon my mind, right? Certain perceptions, impressions, whatnot. And I'm not even using some of the technical words that Locke and Hume would use here, but it's the same. You get the point here. When I say impressions, perceptions, the ideas of the thing, they cause some sort of impression or perception upon my mind, and that's actually what I have access to. I don't have access to the thing in and of itself outside of my impressions. My knowledge of the thing is via my impression of the thing, right? My perception of the thing, right? So, however, it is only these impressions to which one has access. No man can know the thing in and of itself. Merely the idea of the thing as impressed upon him, right? As impressed upon you or I, right? By whatever we're looking at here, right? Now, Hume believes that Locke is onto something. So this is the idea that Hume thinks is right? He's reading John Locke. He thinks this is correct, right? That Locke is onto something. In fact, just so you know, most philosophers have taken this assumption to be true. This isn't something that was then and then tossed out. Many philosophers since that particular time, even down to this day and age, probably it could even be argued, maybe most philosophers have argued that Locke was right in that this is what we have access to, our perceptions of these things. So, however, Hume is also more than ready to extend Locke's observations to their disastrous but logical conclusions. So Hume is going to say, yeah, I'm going to say that's true. Locke's right here, but I'm going to show that this really gets to skepticism. It's going to be very, very bad, right, for the common sense individual, the person that thinks we actually can know stuff. I can know there's a cup here. Right? Now, the first, and ought not be wildly controversial to a Thomist, you don't have to worry about that right now. The first is simply that all of one's knowledge is gained through experience, meaning that I would concede, I would agree that for the most part, most of our knowledge is gained through experience, whether it be the written word, say I'm reading scripture, say I'm reading a text, say I touch, taste, feel, whatever, that my knowledge begins there, and then I can reflect on all that sort of thing. That's just basic empiricism, right? Not necessarily hard empiricism, just basic empiricism. That knowledge is gained through sense experience, right, in some way. Yet, with an already radical turn, the result being that Hume believes all that is available is merely the rapid flow of sense impressions. Now, and then I just make a remark here about, remember, it's the thing out here that we're getting the impression of. And Hume says the only thing we have access to is this rapid flow of all of these impressions coming in from various things I know not what. Whatever they are, there's just a rapid flow. Again, just do one quick glance around the room. Everything that you see external to yourself, you're getting a rapid flow of the wall making an impression, the fireplace making an impression, the trees out the window making an impression, the bookcase making, whatever it is I'm looking at, making an impression, a perception upon my mind, right? Now, notice that what the result must be if true knowledge is limited to these sense impressions, right? Because remember, humans want to say, well, wait a minute, if that's what we have access to, then that by definition is what you have access to, right? You don't have access to the thing in and of itself, what John Locke would call the thing I know not what. You have access to the impression of the things, right? The perception of the things, right? Now, but notice what the result must be if true knowledge is limited merely to these sense impressions, and those things true by which the predicate is contained within the subject by definition, which will be addressed in a moment. And I know that sounds crazy to you, so just don't worry about that parenthetical remark. Because Hume is going to say that we know things by sense impression, right, by our senses, but also the relation of ideas. You can just set that part aside for the moment, the relation of ideas part. For right now, just remember that he's saying whatever these impressions are, that's what you have access to. Not the thing in of itself, the impressions, the perceptions of the things. But notice what the result must be, that if knowledge is limited to that, right? Locke has already planted the notion that the, quote, thing I know not what, cannot be known in itself. And therefore, Hume draws the connection that were a thing to even possess a nature or essence, right, as we've gone over previously, an idea like Plato or Aristotle would even hold, that things have natures and essences. They hold that in a different they disagree as to how that exists, but they both agree that natures and essences do exist. And they believe that you can have knowledge of those things, right? But if you're a step ahead, think about it. If you don't have access to the thing in and of itself, the external I know not what, but just the impression, the idea, the perception of the thing, you ain't gonna be able to know, right, a nature or essence. And in Hume's idea, or in Hume's mind, you might as well never even posit something like that, because that's by definition you can't even know about anyway, right? How do you know it? That's just crazy to say something like that exists when you by definition can't even have access to the thing, right? Because you just have access to the impression, the idea, right? The perception of the thing. Now, so he's saying it's limited to the impressions, your knowledge, Hume would say. And if Hume is concerned with logical connections, and if knowing a thing's nature or essence, which is apparently impossible, would open the possibility for one to know logical connections a priori, according to just what the thing's telos or directness, its goal, right, its purpose is, then you could make a true or a necessary logical connection for induction. But that's exactly what you don't have access to, right? The point was that if you can have access to the nature or the essence of a thing, well, remember when we talked about the knife, going all the way back to the Aristotelian doctrine of natures and essences, those four causes, efficient, material, formal, and final causes. The formal and the final cause, that was where when you know that, right, when you abstract the nature of the essence of the thing, the nature of the thing, the formal cause of the thing, you know what it is, so you know what its purpose is, right? You saw the knife, you know what the purpose of the thing is. But get this, if you know the purpose of the thing, well, then you know the connections, right? You know that if what a knife blade is this type of thing, right, that cuts or whatever, well, then you know that when it does that, right, then it will cut. You know the causal relation between doing this with a knife and material separating, right? That's the event A causes event B, right? There's a causal connection there. And you know that causal connection because you know the nature of the essence of the thing. And so Hume is basically saying that if you don't know the nature or the essence of the thing, because you don't know the thing in and of itself, you have the impression, all you have access to is the perception, the impression of the thing, well, then you don't know what's behind the thing, namely what? A formal cause. You don't know that, Hume would argue. You can't even possibly know something like that, like a nature or essence. You just can't. And so if you can't know the nature of the essence of a thing, well, then how can you even say what the causal relationship is, right? So you're thinking now, earlier, some of you guys, I could tell in the discussion posts, were thinking, yeah, why is this formal cause and this nature and essence of these? What difference does it knowing? What does this make? Well, now you see, this is what locks in your ability to establish causal relationships between things, right? And you may even still be thinking, well, why is that important? Well, think about it. Miracles are supposed to be attributed. They're supposed to be a cause and effect, right? But if you can't know cause and effect relationships, well, then you can't know that God did that, right? Or even the resurrection of Christ, right? Something like that. Or even arguments, right? Any of these sorts of things. You see, now you start to see how all of these ideas have consequences. Remember, that was a principle that we really hit on early in the course, over and over and over and over and over, was that ideas have consequences, right? So let's continue. Now you see where Hume may be going with this, right? Now, as a direct result, according to Hume, the only real knowledge that one may possess comes in two forms: the relation of ideas and matters of fact. The relation of ideas, so this is called Hume's fork. Hume's fork is that, hey, you want to know something? And the reason it's called a fork is if you were to draw it out, there's one point here by way you can know truths, and another point here by way that you can know truths, right? So it's a fork of some sort. Now, and he said these two ways, this fork is the only way you can actually know something. So the first tip is the relation of ideas is simply that upon inspection, something is true if it is logically connected to its predicate, such as bachelors are married males, right? That's just a tautology. That's just true by definition, because there's no new information contained in the predicate that was not already contained within the subject, right? Because a bachelor just is an unmarried male. There's nothing in the predicate, an unmarried male, that wasn't already in the subject being bachelor. A bachelor just is an unmarried male. So that's just true by definition, right? Or a logical relation of ideas would be 1 + 1 = 2, right? That's just true by definition. That's just what it means to add 1 and 1 together. It just is 2, right? So that's the first thing, this logical relation of ideas, right? And the other is this, the other stick in the fork, right? Hume's matters of fact, right? So it has to be either a logical relation of ideas or matters of fact. What are matters of fact? Matters of fact, according to Hume, right, are those truths that can be empirically verified by the senses, such as a woman is standing before me, right? Or I am looking at a cup, right? A pitcher or whatever they call these things, right? I'm looking at that. Prayer. Now, Hume's matters of fact are those truths that can be empirically verified by the senses, such as a woman standing before me. Now, this is what I want to go ahead and point out. We'll address this later. And if you're an apologetics junkie, you may have already heard this, that Hume's fork doesn't fit within either one of those categories. It's not a logical relation of ideas, and it's not a matter of fact that can be verified by my touch, taste, see, feel, smell, any of those, my 5 senses in any shape, form, or fashion, right? If you're already familiar with philosophy or an apologetics junkie, you know the term that we would call for that. So let's just keep going. Now, moving on, this is exactly the point at which Hume thus argues. This is Hume here, quote, "It is only by means of cause and effect that we may go beyond the evidence for our memory and senses." Let me start over. I said senses like some kind of crazy person. Listen, moving on, this is exactly the point at which Hume thus argues, quote, "It is only by means of cause and effect that we may go beyond the evidence for our memory and senses in making judgments about matters of fact." I'll read that again. This is Hume, "It is only by means of cause and effect that we may go beyond the evidence for our memory and senses in making judgments about matters and fact." So he's saying if you're looking at something, right, this hand clap, right, the immediate sense experience is hand, smack, sound. But he's saying in order to try to talk about the causal relationship here, the hands coming together to make the sound, he said, I'm going beyond anything my senses themselves are verifying, because my senses are just showing right now via my eyes, hand, feel, my hands touching, and then sound, audio, right, picking up the sound there. but I'm inferring, but nothing of my senses is showing the cause relationship between that. I'm inferring that. I'm assuming there's a causal relationship between this activity, this, and there being the sound produced, right? That's the point, is that I'm going beyond my sense experience by doing that. And Hume is going to argue this is exactly why you can't really know the cause and effect relationship, because you're going beyond what your senses are showing you there, right? Or hearing, right? Revealing to you, I should say. For instance, he claims that, and this is an example he gives. For instance, he claims that were a man to receive a letter from a friend in France, the man assumes that the letter presented before him with a postmark from France is actually from France. This is one of his exact examples in our text back here, the primary source here. As his prior experiences have told him that there's a connection between these two matters of fact. Postmarks from France, as a matter of fact, and things postmarked from France result from coming from France, right? He's saying this is the inference there. Or another example would be a machine to be observed on an island. Man must have left it, the machine, right? His prior experiences revealed that only man makes machines. Hume then makes the point that it is constantly supposed that there is a connection between the present fact and that which is inferred from that present fact, right? Now, Hume goes on to argue that were this correction shown to be illusory, or in the sense that these supposed connections are about habit and custom, that's what Hume calls it, habit and custom. He says you just think this makes the sound because of your previous habit and custom, right? And this is in regard for any sort of causal connections that you think you see. He says in any real logical sense, there would be no rational basis for accepting these supposed cause and effect as connections. And as mentioned above, this is exactly what Hume will commence to do. Now, again, this relation of cause and effect strikes at the very core, the very heart of induction, right? Because you've got, even within logic, you've got deductive logic and you've got inductive logic, right? And so inductive is the type that the premises don't yield necessary conclusions, right? They yield probable conclusions in some sense, right? So that's putting it rather lightly. Of course, one might object that it is not accurate to say that cause and effect are identical to all forms of induction. So I just go through a couple of examples of this here, and if you want, I can make this available to you, this paper, because I kind of want to continue to go through the paper, but I want to go ahead and skip to this video over here to talk about one of the other problems within Hume. Now, let me see what I want to decide this here. Basically, Hume is saying that, as we've just stated, that all causal relationships are primarily the result of our habits and customs, that we really don't have any justification for knowing the causal relationship between anything. Just like the postmark from France, you'd think it came from France, but it doesn't necessarily come from France. I mean, that could easily be forged or faked, right? It doesn't. There's no logical connection. There's no logical, strictly speaking, logical connection between postmarked envelopes from France and them actually being from France. It's not as if it's postmarked from France, that it just couldn't be any other way, right? So Hume draws this out to its more extreme, its radical, its skeptical conclusion that this is just the way it is for anything, right? Just like you think when you see the postmark from France and the letter being from France, it's the same in regards to even things like the sexual union producing a male, between a male and a female producing a child, right? He's saying that even that you just don't know. And so he's saying you're not justified in knowing. You think you know because you've seen this over and over and over and over and over again. And one of his famous examples is, by the way, in logic, you call this, it's an informal fallacy. It's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, meaning after this, therefore because of this, right? And so the famous example of that, and Hume uses this, is he's like saying, like, look, just because you've seen the sun rise 1,000 times before, and every time the sun rose, there was a rooster that crowed, that doesn't mean that because the rooster crowed that actually caused the sunrise. If you just assume, so any of your ideas about causal connections are just as easily could be like the rooster crowing and the sun rising. You just don't know if that's actually the cause between the two things, right? That's Hume's point, and it is very radical. But again, oddly enough, this has given philosophers for a couple hundred years now fits to try to solve this problem. Now, I go on to try to remark in this paper here that if we do have knowledge of if we can abstract natures and essences, and it's not just the case that we basically reject that belief that what we have access to when I look at this thing is that I have access to my impressions or the perceptions of it. If I reject that, right? If I reject that claim and give some sort of reason to think that I actually know this thing in and of itself and not just my perceptions of it or my ideas of it, well, then that could possibly solve this problem of induction, or at least give us an alternative route in regards to knowing causal relationships. And so I go on to do that, and then I try to argue or point out, and I'm not, just so you know, I'm not saying that these are original to me. It's not as if no one has thought of what I've said here in this particular essay. There's quite a few philosophers that would argue along the same lines, right? And I think those arguments are better, right? I'm not just saying, I'm going to accept these arguments because I want to keep the law of causality in place, right? That clearly that doesn't follow. But go ahead and notice what this would do for some of what are some of the implications for denying any sort of knowledge about law of cause and effect, right? Between law of cause and effect. Notice that this would flush science down the toilet, right? Because science just is the search for causes, right? When some new antibiotic is discovered, right? When some sort of medication is discovered, or God graces us with the ability to cure cancer, right? Science is looking for these types of things because they believe there'd be a cause and effect between this antibiotic and the eradication of that pathogen or whatever it is that antibiotics destroy, right? And this is just what science is, right? The law, the search for causes and effects, and the relationship between the two, and how we can control nature in some sense. Now, if we don't even know if we have no justification for knowing cause and effect, and that's actually true, then science is gone, right? In fact, this is something that Kant, we're going to look at in our next lecture, is going to pick up on very quickly. He wants to save science because during his particular time, Isaac Newton, all the developments that were going on scientifically, he's like, wow, I really don't want to throw all that away, right? And he realizes these implications of what Hume is doing, where they would go, right? That's not to say that he doesn't adopt some of what Hume actually says and think Hume's right. He just wants to try to find some sort of solution to it, even if Hume is right in Kant's view. Now, let's go ahead and swap. Let's go ahead and switch gears here. I'm trusting that you're going along with the text or / recommended readings here to pick up on some more of these nuance. And again, I'll make this available to you, this paper, if you want that, because what I'm going to try to argue, and what many philosophers have tried to argue, is that Hume's really not being consistent. Any of his arguments, and I even say this in the slides, if you look at the slides later, any of his arguments, what they're actually doing is they're going to have to assume the very principle that he's trying to argue against. And we pointed out that Descartes was actually doing that too, right? He was trying to say that our senses weren't necessarily reliable, yet using past experience of his senses, and most importantly, realizing where his senses have corrected his mistakes in order to try to show that his senses couldn't be trusted. But he was trusting them when he was relying on them to correct the very mistakes, right, that he thought that he had made, right? So the problem was really with his judgment, not with what his senses were telling him, right, but his judgment about what his senses were telling him. And I try to point out that Hume is doing something very similar here. For instance, think about it this way. If Hume is right and you don't know the justification if there is no justification between knowing causes and their effects, think about the example that Hume gives when he says that when he tosses out the informal fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc in regard to the rooster. He says, hey, look, just because the rooster comes up, when the sun comes up, rooster crows, sun comes up, it was the rooster that did that, right? That would be a mistake to think that just because it's always preceded that particular event, that A preceded B every time. You were wrong in thinking that the rooster would, you know, the child or whoever is wrong, the simpleton is wrong in thinking that the rooster crows and it makes the sun come up. But get this though, Hume's doing exactly what he says you can't do, right? He's acting as if he knows that the rooster is not what causes the sun to come up, right? But if he knows that it's not, then every negation presupposes some sort of affirmation. He must know something about the cause and effect relationship about the sun rising and roosters in order to say that the rooster wasn't doing it, right? But his very example to try to show that you can't know the cause and effect relationships assumes that he can know something about the cause and effect relationship between roosters crowing and the sun rising, right? He's assuming it, right? In his very analogy, in his very example. Or for instance, remember when he pins these arguments, right? He's assuming that there are connections between your sight and reading paper and your ability to understand the text. He's assuming all of these cause and effect relationships in any of the arguments that he's given. When he talks about the self, how we can't know the self, right? He's assuming he's arguing with other people that are selves, right? He assumes that he is just one, or if he were to say, I'm going to tell you this, right? I is just to say that I am a self, right? It's just, he's assuming that he's a self and trying to say that you can't observe self, right? Well, how would he know, right? What justification does he even have for saying I, right? Some of these arguments about God's existence, dialogue, and again, check these out. I would recommend checking them out. Dialogues concerning natural religion. One of the biggest points he uses that's still touted today to supposedly debunk design type arguments. Now, remember, if you've had the philosophy of religion course, a design argument, the Aristotelian and the Thomistic design argument is going to be different than the modern forms of the ID types of arguments. But either way, he tries to argue that, look, we know lots about building houses, but we don't know anything about the building of a universe, right? And of course, the point of the argument there is the theist side. The point would just be to simply say, if there is design, then there has to be a designer. And Hume just confuses the attributes, knowing the attributes of what the designer would be, with if there is or isn't a designer at all, right? Which that's just not even the point of the argument to say what the particular attributes may or may not be. It's just to simply say, if there's design, then there would be a designer in some sense, right? Things of that nature. But let's go ahead and look at the miracle argument, right? Because Hume wants to argue, and I think this may be one of the more interesting points to you. But Hume wants to argue that you just can't know, right? Again, these causal relationship between miracles, not causal relationship. I'm sorry. He says you're just not justified in believing that miracles happen, even if they do happen. And for that, I'm going to flip over to this video here. Again, filmed right over, not far from here, on the college campus here. That goes over that argument and then one of the problems with Hume's argument. Let's look at that real quickly.
All right, so now let's look at Scottish skepticism.
I actually need to plug in some headphones here, right? Because I don't want to cause the echo effect. Let me see if they're in my drawer. Let me check this drawer right. Chum. All right, guys. So, I can't find my headphones, and I do not want there to be a crazy effect. So I'm going to pause this and be right back. All right, guys. Here we are back, and I have found the headphones. So let's do this. All right, guys. So let's get out of this full screen mode here. My goofy look on my face there. Exit out of that. Bring us back up. And we're back in production. So that's just simply to look at one of the other problems in regard to one of the arguments that Hume is famous for. Because you may be thinking, well, why did you even display this argument from Hume in regards to miracles? Because that's one of his more famous or infamous, depending on what side of the aisle you're on there, right? That's one of the more famous types of arguments that Hume actually brought up and what he's known for. And there's also, just some problems there with that. And the reason those are already just included, they're encapsulated within that particular lecture because that's what we were talking about in the context of that. So, again, in conclusion, I guess we could say, I'll just go ahead and show you some of the slides quickly. Skeptical epistemology, heart of empiricism. There's actually Hume's fork written here. You can read that when you get access to the slides. Objections to God, miracles, so forth. Everything that we've discussed, for the most part, was brought up in the paper and or even in the that lecture there, that presentation there, I should say. Oddly, or not oddly enough, but obviously enough, there's going to be lots of material here for your discussion post this week to think on, to chew on, to go back and forth with. Hope you enjoyed this one. David Hume is one of the more entertaining philosophers to interact with, to read, to wrestle with, to engage his ideas. He's a lot of fun to read. In fact, he's one of the easier philosophers to read, not because his intellect is not because he's not intelligent, right? But because he just has a very friendly writing style. So that's something you want to keep in mind as well. With that said, see you in the next lecture, guys.